What if everything we know about ancient history is wrong? Imagine monumental structures, far predating the Ice Age, built with technologies we can barely comprehend today. These aren't just myths, they're pre-Ice Age pyramids that could rewrite the entire timeline of human civilization. Get ready to have your mind blown. Picture the desert at night. The air cools fast after the sun slips away, and a faint wind rustles across sand that's been here far longer than any human memory. Beneath your feet, under the dunes, under the cracked limestone, lies the skeleton of a story. We've been told for generations that the pyramids of Giza rose about 4,500 years ago, built under kings whose names are still carved on temple walls. But what if that's just the final act of a much older story? What if these colossal shapes were already ancient before the first hieroglyph was ever scratched into stone? You're probably picturing stone cutters in white linen skirts, the sun blazing overhead, oxen dragging sledges of limestone. But try imagining something stranger. The air is cooler, the Nile is wider, the horizon is dotted with grass patches and scattered trees, not endless sand. Far to the north, ice sheets the size of continents grind slowly toward the sea. This isn't the Egypt you learned in school. This is Egypt, before pharaohs, before the desert swallowed the land. In recent decades, a few geologists and historians have noticed details on the Giza Plateau that don't fit the official timeline. Take the limestone enclosure around the Great Sphinx. Its walls are weathered in a way that suggests centuries of heavy rainfall. Rainfall this region hasn't seen in thousands of years. In the 1990s, Boston University geologist Robert Schoch made headlines arguing the Sphinx might be far older than dynastic Egypt, possibly dating back to the end of the last Ice Age. Egyptologists pushed back hard. Where were the artifacts, the inscriptions? To them, without those, the claim didn't hold. So what's eroding the Sphinx? Centuries of rain or just wind and sand? Here's why it matters. Most history books start advanced civilization about 5,000 years ago with city-states and organized farming. But sometimes an artifact or ruin slips into view that whispers, we might have missed something. Look at Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey. Massive carved stones, 11,600 years old, built before agriculture, before cities. It doesn't prove the pyramids are older, but it does prove humans were shaping stone with incredible skill, deep into prehistory. The official story is neat, chronological, and museum-friendly, but history, real history, it's full of rough edges. Stand at the base of the Great Pyramid and touch its weathered blocks. You're touching stone that was already ancient in the age of Homer. It's been rained on, baked, shaken by earthquakes, brushed by the hands of pilgrims, scholars, and looters. It's seen the stars shift in the sky, the desert grow and retreat, the Nile change its course. And the desert hides more than it reveals. In 2013, archaeologists found a complete Roman-era ship buried hundreds of miles from the sea. If a ship can survive in the desert for 2,000 years, what else might be buried beneath the limestone blocks of Giza? Stone is patient and deceptive. A weathered block could be 20 years old or 20,000. That's why the Ice Age theory is so tempting. It paints a messier, older history that doesn't fit neatly into the dynastic timeline. It also leaves us with vast gaps where certainty should be. And in those gaps, imagination grows. Before we keep going, picture this. The pyramids not as the crowning achievement of a young civilization, but as something inherited, something that stood silent for centuries before the pharaohs claimed it. Imagine them as survivors, their sharp edges dulled by thousands of years of wind and rain before the Old Kingdom even began. You don't have to believe it. Just let the possibility drift across your mind like a cloud across the moon. If you've only seen Egypt in photos, documentaries, or maybe a summer trip, you probably think this land has always been dry, the kind of dry that cracks your lips, makes your eyes ache in the glare. Giza's beige plateau feels like a place that's never known rain, But the stones tell another story. The Great Sphinx, guardian of the plateau, is carved directly from bedrock. Around it is an enclosure of limestone walls, and those walls bear deep vertical channels, curling grooves and smoothed edges, patterns water leaves behind. Geologists can tell the difference between wind erosion and rain erosion. Wind cuts horizontally, sharp like a blade. Rain softens, flows, carves pockets and ripples. In the 1990s, Robert Schoch argued these patterns were not the work of mere centuries of wind and sand. They spoke of centuries of heavy rainfall, the kind that hasn't touched Giza in at least 7,000 years. His conclusion? If the Sphinx shows water erosion, it must have been carved long before Pharaoh Khafre's reign, maybe even before the Sahara turned to desert. Egyptologists disagreed. They pointed out the Sphinx's face resembles Khafre's statues. It sits beside his pyramid complex, and the surrounding temples use blocks quarried from the same pit. To them, the simplest answer was that Khafre built it around 2500 BCE. Could the erosion be from wind or from occasional floods caused by rising groundwater? The debate is still alive. Dating stone isn't like dating wood or bone. There's no radiocarbon for limestone. Without an inscription saying carved in year X, it's all interpretation. And the Sphinx isn't alone. The Valley Temple and Sphinx Temple show similar, sometimes worse, erosion. Some believe they were built in a wetter era, then incorporated into the Old Kingdom's designs. To picture that wetter era, you have to step back, way back into deep time. At the end of the last ice age, between 12,000 and 9,000 years ago, polar ice caps melted fast. Global wind and rain patterns shifted. In North Africa, monsoons pushed far north into the Sahara. Vast lakes formed. The Nile swelled with floods far beyond recorded history. If a monument was carved during that time, it could have endured centuries of soaking rain. Imagine standing before the Sphinx back then. The air smells of wet soil and crushed leaves. The plateau is dotted with pools from recent storms. Somewhere, a waterfall tumbles into a rocky basin. The Sphinx, fresh or already centuries old, is darkened by rainwater streaming down its flanks. Even today, rare storms hit the Sahara. In 1975, a single Algerian storm unleashed rivers in places dry for decades. Imagine that kind of rain, but every year, for centuries. If the Sphinx predates the Old Kingdom, the pharaohs didn't build it, they inherited it. Maybe they restored it. Maybe they recarved its face to look like Khafre. That would mean monumental architecture in Egypt began thousands of years earlier than we thought, at a time when, according to the textbooks, humans here weren't supposed to be capable of such feats. The Sphinx won't tell us its age. The grooves in its walls won't whisper the century they were carved. They just sit there, silent, insistent, daring us to match their story to our timeline. As the desert wind brushes over the plateau, you can almost hear the echo of rains fading away, the rivers drying, the land turning from green to gold. Maybe that climate shift, more than any war or dynasty, was the true turning point in Egypt's history. Strip away the hieroglyphs, erase the royal cartouches, forget the carved scenes of pharaohs offering incense to the gods. What's left? Silent geometry, stone stacked with purpose. The blocks don't tell you who placed them there. They don't lean toward one dynasty or another. They just exist. If we could step back far enough beyond the Old Kingdom, beyond writing, before Egypt was even a concept, maybe we'd meet the original builders. Builders whose names time didn't erase out of malice, but out of sheer indifference. It's hard to imagine Egypt without its pharaohs. Their faces dominate the monuments like they were here from the very beginning. But what if they weren't? What if the first great works along the Nile came from a time before kings? No royal inscriptions, no written records, just deliberate, skillful design. It's unsettling, isn't it? We like our history to be a tidy ladder, step by step from simple to complex. But then, there's Göbekli Tepe in southeastern Turkey, massive T-shaped pillars arranged in circles, carvings of foxes, boars, cranes, scorpions. Some stones weighed 20 tons, and all of it built around 9,600 BCE by people with no cities, no pottery, no writing. That's thousands of years before the pyramids, thousands before the temples of Mesopotamia. Göbekli Tepe shows you can have complex architecture without kings, armies, or bureaucracy. So why not on the Nile? Picture a community there before the pharaohs. The river runs higher and broader than today. Forests and marshes flank the banks. Villages of reed houses sit near the water. They fish, they hunt. Maybe they tend early gardens. Knowledge passes from traveler to traveler, not in books, but in memory and repetition. Then slowly, a shared ambition takes root, to build something that lasts. Not a tomb for a ruler, not a monument to ego, maybe a ceremonial platform, maybe a place to watch the stars. We don't know. We might never know, but they'd understand stone's stubbornness. They'd know wood rots and clay crumbles. If you want your voice to survive into an unimaginable future, you speak in stone. The world's oldest musical instrument, a flute made from a vulture's wing bone. Over 40,000 years old, and it still plays. The urge to create something that endures is as old as the urge to sing. If these Nile builders left no inscriptions, what would survive? The stones themselves, worn but still standing. Later, a new people arrives, with kings, scribes, armies. They find these shapes already waiting. They claim them, add their own touches, wrap them in the style of their age, and just like that, the origins are obscured. Stand at the base of a pyramid. Not the smooth white casing you've seen in artist reconstructions. That's long gone. Look at the raw, ancient core blocks. The sunlight hits them and you notice something. They're not all the same. Some blocks are cut so precisely the seams are nearly invisible. Others are rougher, chipped, irregular. And then there are strange marks, grooves, chisel lines, even circular impressions that don't seem to match the copper tools we're told Old Kingdom masons used. According to the official story, the Great Pyramid was built for Pharaoh Khufu around 2560 BCE. It took thousands of workers using copper chisels, dolerite pounding stones, and wooden sledges. Limestone came from nearby quarries, granite from Aswan. And yes, copper can cut limestone, given enough time and effort. But granite is a whole different beast. It's much harder than copper. And the granite blocks inside the pyramid weigh 25 to 80 tons each. Some are polished so perfectly that even today, cutting them to that accuracy would require diamond-tipped tools. In the king's chamber, massive granite beams span the entire ceiling, each as heavy as a loaded rail car. How do you picture men shaping and lifting those with hand tools and pounding stones? When modern explorers first entered the pyramids, they found something stranger still. Some granite surfaces showed long, shallow cuts, like a saw blade had passed through. Others had circular drill holes, deep and spiraled, as if bored by a high-speed drill. Engineers have tried to recreate these with copper tube drills and sand as an abrasive. It works, but painfully slowly. And the spiral grooves in the replicas don't quite match the ancient ones. So what's going on here? Were these just the results of incredible patience? Or are we looking at techniques we've lost? If these methods came from an earlier civilization, maybe Khufu's builders reused not just ideas, but actual blocks. And reuse happened in Egypt. We know later rulers dismantled older structures to build new ones. Sometimes they erased the original inscriptions. Sometimes they left faint ghosts of them under fresh carvings. Why not at Giza? In Aswan, you can still see unfinished obelisks and half-cut granite blocks in the quarries. Some cracked during cutting, others are perfect but never moved. The unfinished obelisk? Over 1,000 tons, abandoned when it split. The fact they were even attempting something that big tells you they had ambition, maybe even inherited know-how from those before them. And lost technology doesn't have to mean science fiction. Sometimes, ancient solutions were just clever and low-tech. Roman concrete lasted for centuries, longer than many modern equivalents. Polynesian navigators crossed thousands of miles without a compass. The stone cutters of Giza, whether Old Kingdom or older, may have had their own forgotten tricks. Even today, at some quarry sites, you can see ancient scoop marks carved in continuous curves, hard to explain with pounding stones alone. Walk among the pyramids and you see the variation, different skill levels, different tool marks. It's not hard to imagine earlier hands shaping some of these blocks, their sweat and dust long gone, only for their work to be claimed by others centuries later. So here's the question. Are these stones purely the work of the Old Kingdom, or are they the last fingerprints of a much older chapter in Egypt's story? Imagine peeling back the layers of time until you're standing here on the Giza Plateau 20,000 years ago. The air feels different. The days are still warm, but nights bite colder. Clouds drift across a sky that today is almost always clear. Step beyond the valley and the world is locked in the last ice age. Massive glaciers cover North America, Northern Europe, and Asia, locking away so much water that sea levels are more than 100 meters lower than today. The outlines of continents are different. Islands we know now are connected by broad plains. The Nile Delta stretches far into the Mediterranean. Egypt itself is too far south for glaciers, but it still feels the ice age's push and pull. Rainfall shifts as global wind patterns change. Some years, the monsoons creep north, swelling the Nile. Other years, the rains retreat and the river runs thin. And the Sahara? It's not an endless desert. Pockets of grassland and steppe break up the sand, dotted with rocky highlands and seasonal rivers. Far away, woolly mammoths roam. Some even survive until about 4,000 years ago, meaning mammoths are still alive at the same time the Great Pyramid is supposedly being built. Think about that overlap for a moment. If an advanced culture existed here during the Ice Age, they'd be dealing with a shifting, unpredictable landscape. The Nile might change course. Floodplains might expand in wet years and vanish in dry ones. Settlements would move constantly, but maybe during a stable period, the rains steady, the Nile flows predictably, and they decide to build something that lasts. Not a royal tomb, not a pharaoh's monument, maybe a place to mark the stars, honor nature, or bring people together. And the Giza Plateau? It's perfect. High ground, safe from floods, positioned with a clear view of the horizon. Then the climate changes again, violently. Around 12,900 years ago, the planet plunges into the Younger Dryas, a sudden return to near-glacial conditions. Temperatures drop, rain patterns shift, large animals vanish. If a civilization had thrived here before that event, it might have been scattered or erased. Mainstream archaeology says people here then weren't capable of pyramid-scale work. But anomalies, like Göbekli Tepe, tell us we can't be too sure. In the Egyptian desert, stone circles at Nabta Playa align with the stars and date back as far as 7,000 years, hinting at astronomical knowledge far older than the pyramids. During the late Pleistocene, you might even see snow in the distant mountains of the Maghreb, not what we picture when we think of Africa. If older monuments did exist here before the Ice Age ended, the rising seas could have erased the evidence, especially in the Nile Delta. But Giza, sitting high and inland, would survive. Picture those earlier builders watching their world change. The green recedes, the floods come less often, the air warms year by year. Maybe they tell their children to remember not just the changes, but the stones they've built. By the time the first pharaohs rise, the Ice Age is long gone. The Nile is calmer. But the plateau may already hold monumental stonework, just waiting to be claimed, reshaped, and folded into a new story. The pyramids might not just be Old Kingdom achievements. They could be survivors from a time when the whole planet looked different, when ice and thaw reshaped continents and human cultures rose and fell with the rhythm of the earth itself. Long before kings, before cities, before the first hieroglyph was carved, there were stories. They were told around fires, whispered on riverbanks, passed down through generations. And some of the oldest stories humanity remembers, they're about water. Not the gentle floods farmers welcome, but a surge so massive it swallows the world. The Sumerians told of Ziusudra, warned by a god to build a boat before a great deluge. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, Utnapishtim survives the flood with his family and animals, repopulating the land afterward. In the Hebrew tradition, Noah builds his ark to ride out 40 days of rain. The Greeks had Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived a flood sent by Zeus. Egypt's flood myth is quieter, folded into its creation story. In the Heliopolitan tradition, the god Atum rises from the primordial waters of Nun onto the first mound of earth, creating the gods, the sky, and the world itself. It's symbolic, yes, but could it be a distant echo of something real? Around 12,000 years ago, as the Ice Age ended, glaciers melted, sea levels rose by more than 100 meters, coastlines drowned. One dramatic spike, called Meltwater Pulse 1A, raised the seas several meters in less than a century. Imagine watching the shoreline creep inland year after year, taking farmland, villages, entire river mouths. If people were living in the Nile Delta then, whole communities could have vanished beneath the rising Mediterranean. Evidence of ancient floods is found elsewhere. In the Black Sea, archaeologists have discovered traces of old shorelines buried under saltwater species. Around 7,500 years ago, the Mediterranean may have surged through the Bosporus, flooding a vast freshwater lake in a geologic instant. Could events like that have seeded the flood myths we still tell? Anthropologists think so. Australian Aboriginal stories describe coastlines and islands lost more than 7,000 years ago, details confirmed by modern geology. If oral tradition can preserve memories that long, why not in Egypt? Maybe Egypt's earliest priests recited verses about a great flood not just as a myth, but as history blurred by time. If the pyramids or their foundations predate the Ice Age's end, their builders might have lived through such a flood. Pictures standing on the Giza plateau, watching the water advance, swallowing fields and villages. People retreat to higher ground, first to ridges, then to hills, finally to the monuments themselves. For a time, maybe the pyramids were islands. Even after the waters recede, the memory remains. Over centuries, it becomes a divine story, a cosmic reset. Later generations might see these massive structures and assume they were built in response to that disaster, to honor the gods who spared the survivors. And here's an odd fact. Ancient Egypt reliefs show enormous boats capable of carrying multi-ton obelisks down the Nile. If that boat-building tradition had deep roots, it might have been what saved entire communities during ancient floods. Flood myths aren't just imagination. They may be humanity's collective memory of times when the sea took the land and the survivors carried their stories forward. Close your eyes and imagine the Sahara, not as the endless ocean of sand we know today, but alive with green. Wide rivers twist through floodplains shaded by acacia trees. Gazelle and antelope scatter as hunters approach. Crocodiles glide silently in slow-moving water. In the distance, the sun glints off the surface of a massive lake. This isn't fantasy, it's the African humid period, roughly 14,500 to 5,500 years ago. The Earth's orbit shifted just enough to nudge the monsoon northward. The rains came, drenching the Sahara, turning it into savanna. Today, satellite images reveal ghost rivers and ancient lake beds beneath the sand, like the veins of a dried leaf. And archaeologists have found pottery, tools, and rock art in what's now the deepest desert. Some of that rock art shows elephants, giraffes, even hippos, and stranger still, boats. Long, sleek vessels carved into cliff faces hundreds of miles from any modern shoreline. Not papyrus skiffs, but sturdy craft, built for rivers or lakes. During this green age, Egypt's Nile floodplain would have been lush and expansive. Seasonal floods were generous, soil was fertile, food was abundant. If monumental construction began in this period, the conditions were perfect. Water could sustain thousands of workers and even help move the stones, wetting the sand to make sledges glide more easily. Seasonal rivers and lakes might have provided extra transport routes for moving heavy blocks. The end of the Green Sahara wasn't gentle. Some evidence suggests it dried gradually. Other data points to sudden shifts, maybe triggered by changes in ocean currents. As the desert returned, people would have been forced toward the Nile Valley. They would have brought their skills, their knowledge, their traditions. Some of that knowledge may have included working stone on a massive scale, techniques honed in other parts of the once green Sahara. In southern Egypt's Nabta Playa, for example, stone circles dating back at least 7,000 years align with the summer solstice. Whoever built them understood astronomy long before hieroglyphs existed. By the time the rains failed completely, the Sahara became a barrier instead of a bridge. Trade routes vanished. the green world faded into memory, preserved only in stories of a time when rivers ran where now only sand lies. If the earliest pyramid phases began in that greener age, imagine how different they would have looked, not surrounded by an endless desert, but by fields, grazing lands, and streams. Perhaps their reflection once shimmered in rainwater pools after summer storms. To later peoples, these monuments would seem like relics from a more generous world, a world they could only dream of. Stand on the Giza Plateau at night. Far from the glare of modern Cairo, the sky opens like an ancient scroll. The air cools quickly after sunset. Above you, stars push forward against the velvet dark. Even now, with city lights stealing much of the view, Orion's belt still hangs clear over the desert, 3 bright points in a perfect row. Thousands of years ago, the sky would have been breathtaking, no light pollution, the stars sharp enough to cast shadows on the sand. For ancient people, the night sky wasn't just beautiful. It was a map, a clock, a calendar. You could tell time by which stars rose. You could plan harvests and ceremonies by the first pre-dawn appearance of certain constellations. If you were building a monument to last for thousands of years, wouldn't you align it to the heavens? In the 1990s, Robert Belleville proposed the Orion correlation theory, the idea that the 3 main pyramids matched the layout of the stars in Orion's belt. When he checked the sky charts, he found the best match was around 10,500 BCE. At that time, the constellation Leo would have risen directly in the east during the spring equinox, exactly where the Sphinx gazes. If true, it suggests the builders were commemorating a date thousands of years before the Old Kingdom. Mainstream Egyptology remains skeptical. Alignments can happen by chance. There's no written record linking the pyramids to Orion. But even without Orion, the precision of the Great Pyramid's alignment to true north is astonishing. Its sides are off by only a fraction of a degree, a feat difficult even with modern instruments. One possible method? Watching the crossing point of 2 circumpolar stars to fix true north. The catch is that Earth's axis wobbles, a slow motion called precession. Those star pairs align perfectly only during certain periods in history. Measurements suggest the ideal alignment for this method happened centuries before the pyramid's supposed construction date. And here's an odd fact. The ancient Egyptians divided the night sky into 36 groups of stars called decans. Each rose at a specific time of year, creating a kind of stellar clock, accurate to within 20 minutes, more than 1,000 years before mechanical clocks. If a pre-dynastic culture worked on Giza, their astronomy might have been a living oral tradition. Aligning monuments to celestial markers could have been both sacred and practical, tying calendars, navigation, and ritual to fixed points in the sky. Precession changes the stars so slowly you wouldn't notice it in a lifetime. But over centuries, elders might realize the stars no longer rose where they once had. How do you preserve that moment forever? Maybe you record it in stone. The shafts in the Great Pyramid are another clue. Around 2500 BCE, they would have pointed to Orion's belt and the star Thuban, then the pole star. But if aimed in an earlier era, they could have targeted different stars entirely, hinting at a different priority, maybe even a different culture. In Egypt, Orion was associated with Osiris, god of the afterlife and rebirth. If the alignment really points to 10,500 BCE, the symbolism might reach even deeper, into myths from before the Sahara turned to sand. Standing here under the night sky, it's easy to believe different peoples, across thousands of years, looked up at these same stars and found meaning. The stones move slowly, the stars move slower. Together they form a dialogue between earth and sky, a language we're still learning to read. Run your hand across a block of the Great Pyramid. You're touching limestone that began its life at the bottom of a shallow sea, millions of years before humans even existed. The Giza Plateau is part of a vast geological formation laid down during the Eocene epoch, when much of northern Egypt was underwater. That ancient sea was alive with coral reefs, mollusks, fish, and predators the size of buses. When the water receded and the land rose, those sediments hardened into limestone, trapping a fossilized memory of that ocean world. Look closely at certain blocks, especially those from deeper layers. You might see coiled shells, coral fragments, even the ghostly outlines of ancient sea plants. In some blocks, fossils are packed so densely the stone looks like solidified shell. Here's a curious fact. One of the earliest scientific observations about the pyramids wasn't made by an Egyptologist, but by a 19th century geologist. Travelers noticed seashells embedded in the stones and realized the material had come from an ancient seabed. Most of the limestone for the pyramids came from right here on the plateau, but some blocks, particularly deep in the core, contain marine sediments not found locally. That's strange. Why bring limestone from somewhere else unless it was already cut? Could these be recycled blocks from even older structures? Marine sediments also leave chemical traces, certain minerals, isotopes, weathering patterns, all hinting at their aquatic origins. When rain or wind wears away the surface today, it sometimes exposes fresh fossil faces, as if the stone is slowly remembering its past. Imagine the journey of a single block. A sea creature lives and dies millions of years ago. Its remains sink into the seabed, get buried in silt. Over eons, it becomes stone. Then, in some much later age, whether the Old Kingdom or long before, humans cut it free and set it in place to reach toward the sky. And here's another odd fact. In Egypt's western desert, there's a place called Wadi al-Hitan, the Valley of the Whales. It's littered with fossilized skeletons of ancient whales, some still with tiny hind legs. 40 million years ago, they swam where today there is only sand. If a pre-Ice Age culture noticed the shells in their building stones, maybe they connected them to stories of floods or primordial seas. Later Egyptian mythology certainly revolved around creation emerging from watery chaos. If some of the limestone came from ruins even older than the pyramids, those fossils would be like a double time capsule, one layer from a vanished ocean, another from a vanished people. Petrographic studies keep finding subtle variations in the Giza limestone that don't fit the simplest all-local stone explanation. Whether it's just different layers of the plateau or evidence of more complex sourcing, we don't yet know. The next time you see an image of the pyramids, try stripping away the thousands of years of history and looking deeper. Picture the blocks as they were in their first life, lying under warm green water, sunlight streaming down through the waves. The pyramids aren't just monuments to human ambition, they're monuments to Earth's deep memory. Stand on the modern shore at Alexandria. The wind smells of salt, waves hiss against stone. But beneath the water lies another Alexandria, a sunken city that once bustled with markets, temples, and harbors. Earthquakes, floods, and the slow rise of the sea swallowed it centuries ago. Divers have found columns, statues, massive quarried blocks, all resting silently under a layer of sand. It's a reminder that the sea is always hungry and the shoreline never still. The Nile Delta has always been vulnerable to both river and sea. Sediment from the Nile pushes the land outward, but storms, floods, and rising water can reclaim it just as easily. Now think bigger. At the end of the last ice age, global sea levels rose over 100 meters. Imagine how much of Egypt's prehistoric Nile Delta that would have drowned. Any towns, ceremonial sites, or even monumental works near the ancient coastline could now be buried beneath the Mediterranean, under layers of mud and silt. We've seen hints of what's possible. In 2000, underwater archaeologists discovered the lost city of Heraklion, also called Tunis, in Abu Qir Bay. Once a thriving port, it sank about 1,200 years ago, probably due to earthquakes and the liquefaction of sandy soil. They found statues, temple ruins, docks, anchors, even wooden ships preserved in the mud. Now imagine rolling the clock back not 1,200 years, but 10,000 years. The shoreline was much farther north. The delta was bigger, its rivers feeding into wide lagoons and marshes. Perfect places for early settlement. If an advanced coastal culture existed, this is where it might have been centered. When the seas rose, much of it would have vanished. Some archaeologists doubt large stone monuments could survive underwater for millennia, but others point to examples from around the world. Stone structures can last surprisingly well if buried quickly by sediment. Odd fact, sonar mapping of Egypt's underwater shelf has revealed buried river channels that no longer exist on land. If we could follow those channels, who knows what we might find? If the first phase of pyramid building predates the end of the Ice Age, the Giza Plateau might just be the inland survivor of a much larger network, its sister sites lost under the sea. Standing on the shore today, you can almost imagine them. Harbors lined with stone quays, bustling markets, priests and waterfront temples. Somewhere out there, under the green water, could be the missing chapter in Egypt's story. The one that explains why the builders of Giza seem to appear already knowing how to work in stone on a colossal scale. We like to picture history as a neat scroll, every year written in order, every event recorded as it happened. But the truth? It's more like a burned library, whole shelves missing, others warped by smoke. For most of human history, nothing was written down at all. The story of Egypt in textbooks begins around 3100 BCE, when Narmer, sometimes called Menes, unifies Upper and Lower Egypt. Hieroglyphs appear soon after, already sophisticated. It almost looks like writing arrives overnight. But that's the trap. Written history makes it seem like civilization itself appears with the first inscriptions, when in reality, it's just the point where we start to see it. And writing survives unevenly. We keep the durable and the bureaucratic, tax records, king lists, while oral epics and everyday life vanish. Odd fact, the world's oldest preserved shopping list is from Mesopotamia, not Egypt. A clay tablet from around 3500 BCE listing deliveries of beer, bread, and livestock. Mundane, but it survived when countless oral histories didn't. If Giza's earliest builders were pre-literate, nothing of their story would survive in writing. No records of their tools, no names, no reasons for building. Later pharaohs could easily have stamped their own names on the site, locking the credit to their reign. The sudden appearance of both hieroglyphs and colossal stone architecture makes it look like a miracle leap, from mud brick to the largest stone structures ever built, in just a few centuries. But what if we're missing the steps in between? Maybe those earlier works were swallowed by the desert, the sea, or simply dismantled. Maybe they were built from materials that didn't last. Or maybe they still stand, but have been reworked so much we don't recognize them for what they were. In archaeology, the earliest written mention of something often becomes the default date of origin. Without older documents, the narrative sticks. And here's the paradox. The written record is our most trusted guide, yet it's the least representative. It shows only the narrow slice of life that was documented by the literate elite, using materials that survived. That means Egypt's true origins could be older, stranger, and more complex than the timeline we know. If the pyramids stand on foundations laid before writing, they're not just monuments to stone craft, they're monuments to memory without words. Ancient Egypt had its kings, but before the kings, it had its myths. One of the oldest comes from the so-called Turin King List, a fragmentary papyrus that claims Egypt was ruled long before the pharaohs by the Shemsu Hor, the followers of Horus. Who were they? The texts don't say much. They list them as divine or semi-divine rulers, reigning for thousands of years. Some entries give them lifespans so long they sound impossible, centuries per ruler. Mainstream scholars see them as mythic ancestors, not historical figures. But in Egypt's worldview, myth and history weren't always separate. Kings linked themselves to the gods in a continuous chain, stretching back to creation itself. If there was a pre-dynastic elite, perhaps the followers of Horus are a hazy memory of them, remembered in stories long after their cities, tools, and even their names were gone. Some later traditions in the ancient world spoke of giant builders, not literal giants, but a race of people with extraordinary skill. The Greeks told of cyclopes who cut and stacked enormous stones. In the Levant, biblical texts refer to Nephilim and Anakim in the distant past. In Egypt, there are tales of structures so old that the pharaohs themselves claimed only to have restored them. Some temple inscriptions even say the plans for certain buildings were found on ancient scrolls from the time of the gods. If those scrolls ever existed, they're long gone. Papyrus doesn't survive millennia unless perfectly preserved, but the idea of an earlier age of builders lingered. It shows up in legends, in priestly accounts recorded by Greek visitors like Herodotus and Diodorus Siculus. They wrote that the pyramids were attributed by some to a time before the known kings, even before the Great Flood. Could these stories be echoes of a real pre-dynastic tradition of stone building? We know that when dynastic Egypt emerged, it was already highly organized, with engineering, art, and religion fully developed. It's as if the culture inherited a toolkit, not just of skills, but of ideas about how to shape the land in stone. If the followers of Horus were real, they may have been the last link in that older chain, the final generation before a climate shift or disaster wiped the slate clean. To later Egyptians, they were more than ancestors. They were the bridge to the divine. And to us, they're a tantalizing hint that Egypt's roots might run deeper than we think. When you look at the Sphinx today, you're not seeing it as the old kingdom left it. You're seeing something that's been patched, rebuilt, and recarved over thousands of years. The body is heavily restored, layers of blocks added to shore up crumbling limestone. The paws have been rebuilt more than once. Even the neck shows patchwork. And here's the surprising part. Some of that repair work is ancient. Archaeologists have found Old Kingdom masonry alongside much earlier weathering, suggesting the pharaohs weren't the first to mend the monument. In the New Kingdom, over 1,000 years after Khafre, Pharaoh Thutmose IV claimed he restored the Sphinx after a dream. The dream stele between its paws tells the story. While hunting near the half-buried statue, Thutmose fell asleep in its shadow. The Sphinx appeared in a dream, promising him kingship if he would clear away the sand and honor it again. He did, and left the stele as a record. But what about before him? If Khafre carved the Sphinx, why would it already have needed major restoration in his own reign? If it's older, then restoration work could go back further still, maybe even to hands we can't name. The pyramids show repairs too. In some spots, you'll see blocks of very different quality, fresh, squared limestone alongside weathered, pitted stone. Some casing stones don't match the local quarry, hinting they were brought from elsewhere, perhaps recycled from other monuments. It's the same with temples on the Giza plateau. The Valley Temple, for example, is built from massive limestone blocks with granite facing. Later additions use smaller, neater blocks, a clear change in building style. Restoration is a double-edged sword for archaeology. It preserves the structure, but it also blurs the timeline. If a pharaoh's masons replaced older blocks, it's easy to assume he built the whole thing. And ancient restorers weren't shy about erasing or overriding earlier marks. Sometimes they recarved inscriptions, replacing the original name with their own. To them, this wasn't theft, it was renewal, tying themselves to the monument's legacy. Which means we can't always trust that the builder named on a structure was its first creator. That's why the idea of inherited monuments is so intriguing. We have proof that later rulers maintained and modified older works. So why not the pyramids themselves? If the earliest phase of Giza's monuments was already centuries or millennia old by the time of Khufu and Khafre, those pharaohs may have been restorers as much as builders. Walk up close to the stones of the pyramids and temples. Run your fingers along the surface. You'll notice something that doesn't match the simple copper chisel and pounding stone image we've all been taught. Some blocks are rough with jagged edges. Others are so smooth they look machine polished. And then there are the strange ones, with long parallel grooves or perfectly round holes drilled deep into granite. Granite is tough, harder than steel on the Mohs scale. Cutting it with copper tools, as the standard model suggests, is possible, but painfully slow. Modern experiments using copper saws and sand can reproduce some results, but nothing quite like the precision found in places like the King's Chamber. The granite beams above that chamber are enormous, 25 to 40 tons each. They're fitted so tightly you can't slide a sheet of paper between them. In some abandoned works at Aswan, unfinished granite pieces show spiral drill marks that look almost like they were bored with a high-speed bit. Engineer Chris Dunn famously argued the feed rate on those spirals suggested advanced machinery. Mainstream archaeologists disagree, saying abrasives and patient labor could do the job. Still, when you compare the marks on Old Kingdom granite to those on later works, you notice differences. The earlier cuts often look cleaner, the joins tighter. It's as if the skill level decreased over time, which doesn't fit the idea of technology steadily improving. Some limestone blocks at Giza also show evidence of being shaped in ways that suggest wet stone or a reconstituted material, almost like a kind of ancient concrete. There's debate over this, but it's possible some parts of the monuments used cast stone rather than quarried stone. Tool marks aren't just random scratches, they're fingerprints. If we could fully decode them, we might be able to tell which stones were shaped in the same period and which came from earlier phases. Even the choice of stone is telling. Basalt flooring in the temples, granite lining for the passageways, softer limestone for the bulk of the pyramids, each selected with an understanding of how it would weather and how it would work structurally. And here's the strange thing. Some of the most precise work isn't in the parts of the pyramid you can see from the outside. It's inside, in the hidden chambers and passages. If this was all about show, why put your finest stonework where no one but a handful of priests or workers would ever see it? It suggests a purpose beyond appearance, and perhaps a builder's mindset different from that of the later dynasties. When you see a block that's worn and irregular next to one that's razor straight, you start to wonder, were they made centuries apart? Was one copied from the other? Or did different hands from different ages leave their marks on the same wall? Ask almost anyone what the pyramids were for, and you'll hear the same answer: tombs for the pharaohs. It's the standard line in textbooks, museums, and documentaries. And yes, pyramids from later dynasties were definitely used as tombs. But the Giza pyramids? Here's the twist. No pharaoh's body has ever been found in them. The Great Pyramid's so-called King's Chamber was empty when first recorded in modern times. No mummy, no coffin, no inscriptions claiming it as Khufu's eternal resting place. Just a granite box, lidless, set into the floor. Some argue the burial goods were stolen in antiquity. That's possible. Egypt has a long history of tomb robbing. But the lack of decoration is strange. Royal tombs from the same period, like those in the Valley of the Kings, are covered with texts and images meant to guide the dead through the afterlife. The Giza pyramid's chambers are bare. Even the sarcophagus is unusual, carved from a single block of granite with dimensions slightly too large to fit through the passageways. That means it must have been placed there before the chamber was finished. So if it wasn't a tomb, what was it? Some researchers suggest the pyramids were giant observatories aligned to key stars and solstices. Others think they were giant markers in a geodetic grid, part of a system for measuring Earth. Then there are the more unconventional ideas, that the internal passages and chambers acted like resonating cavities, perhaps for rituals involving sound or energy. Even within mainstream Egyptology, there's an acknowledgement that the pyramid's exact construction methods and intended functions are still debated. If Khufu's builders inherited a much older structure, they may have repurposed it as a tomb or simply claimed it as a symbol of divine authority. That would explain the mismatch between the pyramid's engineering sophistication and the relatively sparse Old Kingdom inscriptions. The question then becomes, if the original purpose wasn't burial, what drove such a colossal project? A monument to the gods? A marker for navigation? A structure tied to the stars in a way we no longer understand? And here's a curious point. The three main pyramids at Giza aren't the only ones with mysteries. Across Egypt, there are pyramids that are little more than massive stone platforms or step-like mounds. Some are unfinished, others deliberately dismantled. It's possible the pyramid form evolved from much older platforms, structures whose functions we can only guess at now. What we call the Pyramid Age may not have been the beginning of the form at all, but rather its final, perfected phase, a phase that began long before Khufu's name was ever carved in stone. When archaeologists map the Giza Plateau, they focus on the big three pyramids, the Sphinx, and the temples. But beneath and around these giants are clues to something older, a possible Phase Zero of construction. Phase Zero isn't a formal term you'll find in textbooks. It's a way of describing the idea that before the pyramids we see today, there was an earlier stage of building, maybe smaller, maybe simpler, but laying the groundwork for what came after. You see hints of it in the bedrock cuts around the Sphinx. Some channels and trenches don't match the known construction phases. They look like they were carved for something else entirely, then reused. The same goes for some foundation blocks under the pyramid temples. Massive limestone blocks, far bigger than what's typical in Old Kingdom construction, formed the base with smaller, more regular blocks stacked on top from later periods. It's like finding an older stone wall inside the foundations of a modern house. One striking example is the so-called Wall of the Crow, a massive barrier south of the Sphinx. Its lower courses are made from enormous, irregular blocks, some weighing tens of tons, while the upper courses are built from smaller, more standardized stones. Two building styles, two skill sets, maybe even two eras. There's also the mysterious Osiris shaft beneath the Giza Plateau. It plunges deep into the bedrock in 3 levels, ending in a chamber partially filled with water. Its construction style doesn't match any known tombs, and there's no decoration. Some think it's a symbolic underworld. Others believe it could be connected to an earlier, now-lost water system. Phase 0 might have been the work of a culture testing the site, carving out quarries, creating platforms, aligning early structures to the stars. Over centuries, those works could have been incorporated into the grand designs of the Old Kingdom. The problem is, once later builders reworked these older elements, the archaeological fingerprint gets blurred. You can't easily tell where one era ends and the next begins. If this theory is right, the Giza we know is a palimpsest, a layered record of multiple civilizations, each building over and around the work of those before. Think of it like a cathedral in Europe built on the foundations of a Roman temple, which itself sits on a prehistoric mound. The site's sacredness is continuous, even if the architecture changes. And maybe that's the real story of Giza. Not a single burst of genius in Khufu's time, but a slow accumulation of skill and meaning, stretching back into prehistory. Civilizations don't always end with an invasion. Sometimes they just dry out. Around 4,200 years ago, Egypt was hit by one of the worst climate events in its history. Rain patterns shifted, the Nile floods failed, and famine swept the land. This 4,200-year event is recorded not just in Egypt, but across the Middle East and beyond.
The Old Kingdom, the age of the great pyramid builders, collapsed soon after. Grain became scarce, villages emptied, the central government fractured into warring provinces. Texts from the time describe hunger so severe that people abandoned the dead, or worse. If this could wipe out the wealth and stability of Egypt's most powerful dynasty, imagine what a bigger, earlier climate collapse might have done to a smaller, less resilient civilization. The Sahara itself tells a similar story. As the African humid period ended, the rains retreated south. Once lush savannas turned to dust, rivers dried, lakes shrank, and people were forced to migrate. If there was an earlier building culture in North Africa, maybe one that had begun monumental works in the Green Sahara or along a broader Nile, they could have been scattered by such a shift. In that kind of crisis, survival comes first. Stone monuments don't feed you. Grand construction stops. Knowledge once shared between regions is lost as communities become isolated. Over time, those scattered descendants might return to the old sites, the high plateaus, the riverbanks, the quarries, and find the ruins of a greater past. And here's where human nature kicks in. If you discover a massive, abandoned monument, you don't ignore it. You claim it. You weave it into your own story. You say, "Our ancestors built this," and you mean it, even if the truth is older and more complex. Later Egyptians did exactly this. Pharaohs boasted of restoring temples from the time of the gods. They reinscribed older statues with their own names. They rebuilt on ancient foundations as if they'd been the first to lay them. But beneath those restorations might be the last fingerprints of a civilization erased not by war, but by the slow, relentless march of climate change. It's a sobering thought that the grandeur of Giza may be the afterglow of a culture we barely know existed, snuffed out by forces no army could fight. Religions change slowly. They carry echoes of the past like a river carries silt.
mixing the new with grains of something far older. When the first pharaohs ruled Egypt, their gods already had complex roles, myths, and symbols. That kind of depth doesn't appear overnight. It hints at beliefs that had been evolving for centuries, maybe millennia. Take Osiris, god of the afterlife, death, and rebirth. In the classic myth, Osiris is killed, dismembered, and restored to life by his wife, Isis. Their son Horus avenges him, defeating the usurper Set. It's a story of death and resurrection, of cosmic struggle, of the rightful ruler returning. But look closer, it's also tied to the cycles of nature, the flooding and retreat of the Nile, the planting and harvesting of crops. If an earlier Nile civilization lived through catastrophic floods or sudden drought, these patterns might not have been more than seasonal. They could have been the difference between survival and collapse. Encoding them in myth would make sense. The Benben stone, sacred in Heliopolis, is another clue. It's a pyramid-shaped relic said to mark the spot where the creator god Adam first emerged from the waters of chaos. Its form mirrors the shape of the pyramids themselves. Was the pyramid form inspired by religion, or was religion shaped by monuments already standing? The daily journey of the sun god Ra, sailing across the sky by day and through the underworld by night, may preserve astronomical observations from long before writing. If the earliest builders aligned their monuments to the sun's path or the stars' positions, those alignments could have been woven into theology. Even the weighing of the heart in the afterlife, where the deceased's heart is measured against the feather of Ma'at, may have echoes in an older worldview about balance, justice, and harmony with nature. Egyptian religion, like Egyptian architecture, seems to appear fully formed in the historical record. But if it inherited elements from a forgotten culture, that would explain the sudden sophistication, why the earliest texts already contain layered myths, cosmic geography, and a fully developed pantheon. In this sense, the gods themselves might be monuments, built from the memories of an age when the Nile flowed through a greener, stranger world. We've debated the pyramids for centuries. Were they built entirely by the Old Kingdom, or do they hide the bones of something far older? For most of history, all we had were the stones, the stories, and our own imaginations. Now, for the first time, we have tools that can look inside without breaking a single block. In recent years, teams have used muon tomography, a kind of cosmic X-ray, to scan the Great Pyramid. High-energy particles from space pass through the stone, revealing voids and densities inside. In 2017, researchers announced they'd found a massive, unexplained cavity above the Grand Gallery, a space large enough to fit an airliner. It doesn't appear on any ancient plans we know of, and no one has entered it. Is it a hidden chamber from Khufu's time, or a relic from an earlier phase of construction? Ground-penetrating radar is also mapping the bedrock around the pyramids. It's already shown that the Giza plateau is riddled with cut trenches, buried walls, and possible shafts, some extending far below the visible structures. Geologists are re-examining the weathering on the Sphinx enclosure, comparing it to natural erosion in the region. If that erosion is mainly from rainfall, as some claim, it could push the carving of the Sphinx back thousands of years into a wetter climate period. Then there's DNA and isotope analysis of ancient remains. These tests can reveal population movements, trade routes, even diet changes, clues to whether a large, organized society might have existed in the Nile Valley long before the pharaohs.
Satellite imagery is another game changer. It can detect soil disturbances, buried structures, and even ancient riverbeds invisible at ground level. Already, it's identified hundreds of possible sites in Egypt that haven't yet been excavated. The challenge is access. Political stability, funding, and competing academic theories all shape what research gets done. Some discoveries sit in storage for years before they're analyzed or published. But the technology is here, and it's only getting better. If there is a Phase Zero hidden in Giza's foundations, if the pyramids we see are built on the bones of something far older, science now has the means to find it.
The next breakthrough might not come from a trowel in the sand, but from a burst of cosmic particles, a satellite image, or a 3D map of the ground beneath our feet. One day we may know for sure whether the story of Giza is the tale of a single golden age or the echo of civilizations stacked like the very stones of the pyramids themselves. Picture the Giza Plateau one last time. The wind moves over the sand, whispering against stone that has stood for longer than any written history. We've followed its story through shifting climates, rising seas, and human hands separated by thousands of years. We've looked at myths of floods and gods, tool marks in granite, ancient restorations, and the possibility that today's pyramids sit on foundations laid by people we don't even have names for. Maybe Khufu, Khafre, and Menkaure built them from scratch in the 4th dynasty. Maybe they inherited them, restoring and repurposing what was already ancient in their time. Maybe the truth is somewhere in between, a layering of cultures, each adding to a monument too sacred to abandon. Giza might be the greatest palimpsest on Earth, a message written and rewritten over tens of centuries. What we do know is that it's not just a relic of one civilization's golden age, it's part of a much bigger human story, a story of survival, adaptation, and the need to leave something behind that will outlast us. If the pyramids really do preserve the work of a forgotten age, then they are more than tombs or temples. They are time capsules from deep history, carrying across the rise and fall of worlds. And maybe that's the most remarkable thing. Not the precision of the stonework, not the scale of the engineering, but the fact that they're still here, still holding the same ground while everything else, rivers, coastlines, and kingdoms, has shifted around them. When you stand before them, you're not just looking at Egypt's past, you're looking at humanity's persistence. And whether their story began 4,500 years ago or 14,500 years ago, the pyramids will likely keep their secrets a while longer, until we're ready or lucky enough to learn the truth carved into their bones.